What kind of father sells his daughter like cattle? That was the thought burning inside Thomas Brennan's mind the moment he saw her standing in his doorway. Clara was only 17, barely more than a child. She clutched a faded carpet bag with both hands, as if it were her only shield against the world. Her golden hair caught the firelight, like threads of wheat. Her eyes were as blue as a mountain lake, but it was her silence that made the cabin feel colder than the Montana snow outside. She had not spoken a single word since her father counted the bills, signed the papers, and walked away without looking back. Thomas wiped his palms against his worn denim pants, suddenly aware of the rough cracks in his cabin walls, the shadows that flickered across pine boards, and the loneliness that had long filled this place. At 34, he had grown used to solitude. His ranch stretched miles across frozen land, the nearest neighbor 15 miles south. Winters so long a man sometimes forgot what another voice even sounded like. He had sent for a wife through the matrimonial papers, expecting a widow, maybe a woman nearer his own age, someone who knew how to survive the harsh life of the frontier. But what he got was Clara, a frightened girl who looked at him as though he were another wolf waiting to devour her. "You hungry?" Thomas asked, his voice rougher than he meant. Clara's eyes flicked toward him, then away again, settling on the fireplace where embers glowed faintly. She shook her head, just once. The marriage contract crinkled in Thomas's shirt pocket, legal by the law of the Montana Territory, signed and sealed. Her father had taken the money in exchange for his daughter's hand, money Thomas had saved for years of hard work. On paper, everything was proper. But as he looked at her slight frame swallowed by a wedding dress too big, his stomach twisted with guilt. He had dreamed of filling this cabin with warmth, laughter, the sounds of children running barefoot on wooden floors. Now silence filled every corner, so heavy it pressed against his chest. "The spare room's yours," Thomas finally said, pointing down the hall. "Lock works from the inside." For the first time since she arrived, Clara looked directly at him. Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe even a touch of relief. She clutched her bag tighter and nodded. Outside, the wind howled through pine branches, and snow began to fall in heavy flakes. Winter was coming early this year, and soon they would be trapped together in ways neither of them had ever imagined. Days passed in a careful rhythm. Thomas rose before dawn to tend his cattle, fighting bitter winds that froze a man's breath in his beard. He came home to find Clara moving quietly through the kitchen, cooking simple meals and cleaning as if her life depended on it. But she never spoke, never looked him in the eyes longer than a moment. On the fourth morning, Thomas walked into the kitchen and froze. Clara stood barefoot at the window, her thin cotton nightgown no match for the Montana cold. Frost traced wild patterns on the glass, and her lips were tinged blue. "Jesus, girl, you'll catch your death," he muttered, rushing for the wool blanket draped over the couch. He wrapped it around her shoulders, careful not to startle her. She flinched at his touch, but didn't pull away. "Clara," he said softly, waiting until she looked up at him. "This ain't right. None of this is right." Her eyes widened, fear flickering like candlelight. Did she think he meant to send her back? Back to the father who had sold her like livestock. "I know what that paper says," Thomas went on, his voice breaking with something he hadn't felt in years. "But you're still a child. I ain't the kind of man who will take what ain't freely given. Nothing has to happen here that you don't want." Nothing. Clara's small hands clutched the edge of the blanket. For a long moment she said nothing, then finally whispered, her voice trembling. "Papa said you'd expect certain things. Said it was my duty now." The words struck Thomas like a punch to the gut. He pictured her father's empty eyes, his greedy hands counting Thomas's hard-earned money, and rage rose in his chest. "Your papa was wrong," Thomas said firmly, stepping back to give her space. "You're safe here. That's all that matters." For the first time, he saw the wall around her begin to crack. Her eyes softened, filling with tears she tried to hide. She pulled the blanket closer around her small frame and nodded. Relief washed through him, but before he could say more, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the morning silence. Thomas's blood ran cold. Riders. 4 of them, coming fast. He moved to the window, heart pounding. Outside, men on horseback approached the cabin. The lead rider carried authority in the way he sat tall in the saddle, a silver badge gleaming on his coat, a territorial marshal. Behind him rode 3 others, faces hard as stone. Thomas recognized one instantly, William Hayes, Clara's uncle. The other 2 were hired guns with dead eyes and twitching hands that hovered near their holsters. The marshal dismounted, boots crunching against frozen ground, and knocked hard on the door. The sound thundered through the cabin, rattling every nail. Thomas reached up, his fingers brushing the rifle mounted above the fireplace. Clara pressed herself against the kitchen wall, the blanket wrapped around her trembling shoulders like armor. "Open up, Brennan," the marshal's voice called, cold and commanding. "Official business." Thomas's jaw clenched as he lifted the latch. He stepped out onto the porch, the bitter air biting into his lungs. 4 men faced him. Clara's uncle sneered, his lips curled with cruel satisfaction. The hired guns shifted like wolves ready to strike. The marshal's expression was calm, but his words carried weight. "Complaint was filed yesterday. Says you're harboring a minor against her family's wishes. That so?" Quote. Thomas kept his voice steady, though ice filled his veins. "Might want to check your paperwork, Marshal. Girl's my lawful wife. Married proper, with her father's blessing." Hayes spat tobacco into the snow and snarled. "That marriage ain't legal. Girl was coerced. We got witnesses say you forced her into it." Thomas's stomach dropped. He saw the trap now. They meant to drag him to court, lock him away, and take Clara back. By the time he cleared his name, she would be lost forever. And then he heard the soft creak of the cabin floorboards behind him. Clara stepped into the doorway, still wrapped in the blanket, her face pale but her voice steady. "Uncle William," she said, "I wondered when you'd come." The snow swirled between them, the air heavy with danger. Thomas realized in that instant they were standing on the edge of something that could change both of their lives forever. The porch fell into silence. The wind whipped snowflakes between the cabin and the men on horseback, each one sparkling like shards of glass. Clara stood barefoot beside Thomas, the wool blanket tight around her shoulders, her blue eyes locked on her uncle. Marshal Garrett shifted in his saddle, his badge glinting in the pale light. "Miss Hayes, you need to come with us," he said in a steady voice. "There have been allegations about your situation here. We can't ignore them." Clara's gaze flicked to Thomas, then back to the marshal. Her voice, though quiet, carried across the clearing protection. She repeated, her laugh sharp and bitter. "Is that what Uncle William called it?" William's jaw tightened. "Don't listen to her lies." "She's confused. Girl doesn't know what she's saying." But Clara didn't falter. Her chin lifted, and with each word her voice grew stronger. "When Papa first talked about this arrangement, Uncle William told him I was too pretty to waste on a poor cowboy. He said he knew men in Denver who'd pay 3 times as much, men who wouldn't bother with marriage papers." The hired guns shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another. Even the cold mountain air seemed to thicken under the weight of her words. Marshal Garrett narrowed his eyes. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Hayes." Clara reached into the pocket of her gown and pulled out a folded letter. Her fingers trembled, but her resolve didn't break. "Uncle William wrote this to Papa. He kept it because he couldn't read. Asked me to read it for him later. But I never did." Quote. Garrett unfolded the paper slowly. His weathered face hardened as his eyes moved over the words. When he looked up, there was no mistaking the shift in his tone. "This letter describes illegal arrangements, dealings with establishments we've been watching in Denver for months. William Hayes, you got an explanation." William lunged forward, his face twisting with desperation. "She wrote that herself. She's lying to save her own skin." Garrett's eyes flashed cold. "Handwriting matches other samples of yours we've seen. And the details are too exact. You've been caught, Hayes." For the first time since Thomas had opened the door, he felt the weight in his chest begin to ease. The lawman wasn't blind. He saw the truth for what it was. Clara's uncle snarled, his words dripping with venom. "This ain't over, Clara. You'll regret crossing blood." But Clara didn't flinch. Her voice rang clear and final. "Papa's dead, Uncle William. He drank himself into the grave 3 days after you left with Thomas's money. There's no blood left for me to betray." The words struck harder than any bullet. William's face paled, rage and fear twisting together as Garrett stepped forward with iron shackles. "You're under arrest for conspiracy and attempted trafficking," the marshal declared. He turned to the hired guns. "And you two, if you've got any sense, you'll ride out while you still can." The men hesitated only a second before scrambling back onto their horses, spurring them hard toward the valley. Snow kicked up in their wake as they disappeared into the pines, leaving William alone to face justice. Garrett bound William's wrists with practiced efficiency. The outlaws' protests echoed across the clearing, but they carried no weight now. The truth had been spoken, and it could not be taken back. As the marshal led the disgraced uncle away, Thomas felt Clara's small hand brush against his arm. Her touch was gentle, but full of meaning. He looked down at her, and in her eyes he no longer saw the silent, frightened girl who had arrived at his cabin days ago. He saw a survivor, a young woman who had chosen to stand her ground in the face of the man who'd tried to sell her soul. Snow kept falling, blanketing the world in white silence as the lawmen rode off with their prisoner. For the first time since she had stepped into his life, Thomas felt something bloom in the frozen air. Hope. Clara turned to him, her lips trembling into the smallest of smiles. "You've been kinder to me than any man in my family ever was," she whispered. Thomas swallowed hard, the ache in his chest both heavy and light. They were not out of danger yet, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever storms came next, they would face them side by side. The cabin was quiet again once the riders vanished into the snow. The fire crackled softly, shadows dancing across the pine walls. Thomas shut the door and leaned his rifle back above the fireplace. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold but from the storm that had just passed. Clara still stood near the door, the wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a shield. Her bare feet pressed against the wooden floor, yet she looked steadier than she had since the day she arrived. Thomas broke the silence. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "About your father. About that letter." Clara turned her face toward the firelight, her golden hair catching its glow. When she finally spoke, her words were clear, no longer the whispers of a frightened girl. "Because I needed to know what kind of man you were. If you were like them. If you would use me, or protect me." She looked up at him, her eyes steady. Now I know the words cut deep into Thomas, not with pain, but with something he had not felt in years, a fierce sense of purpose. He had expected a wife to share chores, to fight loneliness, maybe to give him children. He had not expected to become a shield for a girl who had already seen more cruelty than most women twice her age. "You don't owe me anything, Clara," he said softly. "Not your duty, not your silence. This house is yours as much as it's mine. What you give by choice." Her lips curved into a fragile smile, the first true smile he'd seen on her face. She pulled the blanket tighter and stepped toward him. "Then my choice is to stay." Something shifted between them in that moment. Not love, not yet. It was too soon for that, but trust. The first brick in something stronger than either of them had ever known. The weeks that followed were harsh. Snow piled against the cabin walls, the wind howled across the empty plains, and the cold clawed its way under every door. But inside, the cabin grew warmer. Clara began to hum softly as she worked in the kitchen. She mended Thomas's shirts by the fire and laughed once when he burned a biscuit black. That laugh was like sunlight after a storm, and Thomas realized he would do anything to hear it again. Little by little, the silence that had weighed so heavily on them began to fade. Clara asked questions about the ranch, about cattle, about how to ride. Thomas taught her patiently, never rushing, never demanding. He watched her confidence grow like a flame that refused to die. By spring, the cabin no longer felt empty. It felt alive. Years passed. The land tested them with droughts and long winters, but they endured together. Clara grew from a girl into a woman, her strength carved from the same wild earth as the mountains that surrounded them. She was no longer the trembling child who had arrived at his door. She was his partner, his equal. And one day, when Clara was 25, the sound of a child's laughter filled the cabin, their daughter running barefoot across the same wooden floors where Clara had once stood silent and afraid. That night, as Thomas sat by the fire, Clara rested her head against his shoulder. "Do you know when I truly began to love you?" she asked softly. Thomas shook his head, his rough hand covering hers. "It wasn't the day Papa sold me, or the day you promised I was safe," she whispered. "It was the day you gave me the choice to be more than what others decided for me. You didn't buy me, Thomas. You freed me." He kissed her golden hair, his throat too tight for words. Outside their window, snow began to fall again, covering the Montana wilderness in a blanket of white. Clean, untouched, endless with possibility. Inside, the fire burned warm, and in that cabin built from his dreams, Thomas finally had what he'd longed for, not just a wife, but a family. And Clara, once sold and broken, had found the one thing she thought she'd never have again, her freedom and the love that grew from it.